Early spring of 1874, Bridgeport, Connecticut, was a thriving but tightly knit coastal town. While the city bustled with new industry and the hum of shipyards, its social life remained conservative, almost puritanical, which is why, when the brutal murder of Thomas Delaney was discovered, it didn't just shock the community, it splintered it. Thomas Delaney was, by all accounts, a respectable man. At 42, he ran one of the city's most reliable dry goods stores and was admired for his calm demeanor and charitable donations to the local parish. He had been a widower for some years before marrying Eleanor Whitcomb, a 26-year-old orphan from New Haven with no known family and little money. Some saw the union as peculiar. Others romanticized it as the salvation of a lonely young woman by a gentleman. But beneath Bridgeport's manicured sidewalks and gaslit charm, something had gone terribly wrong. On May 12, 1874, Thomas was found dead in the parlor of his Golden Hill Street home. He was seated in his armchair, a book in one hand, and a faint trail of blood soaked into his waistcoat. The coroner's report noted a precisely placed gunshot to the chest, no sign of forced entry, and no blood trail, meaning he had likely been shot where he sat. Eleanor claimed she returned from her afternoon walk and discovered the scene. She was frantic, almost incoherent, as neighbors arrived to her cries. But several who gathered noted something odd. Her gloves were missing, and her boots were clean, despite recent rains that had muddied the street corners. The police were inexperienced in murder investigations. There had been only 2 known homicides in Bridgeport in the previous 5 years. They initially leaned towards suicide, especially given Thomas's recent bouts of insomnia. But after only 2 days, that theory fell apart. The editor of the Bridgeport Standard received an anonymous, typewritten letter, a rarity in that era, claiming Thomas's death was no suicide, and that Eleanor had been engaged in a long-running affair with a local dock worker named Samuel Crane. The letter contained specific information, names of inns they had met in, a description of the silver locket Eleanor had supposedly given Samuel, and a date on which they were seen at the old Branford boarding house. Police followed the lead. A former innkeeper, Mrs. Agnes Temple, recalled Eleanor, described her as quiet, watchful, always with her eyes on the exit. She confirmed that Eleanor had stayed there under the name Mrs. Hartley and had been visited by a rough-looking man she identified from a sketch as Samuel Crane. Samuel was known around the docks as a gambler, a drinker, and a man prone to violence. He'd been fired 2 weeks before the murder after assaulting a co-worker with a hammer. But when authorities arrived at his lodgings, they found his room empty, bed unmade, closet half-packed, and a blood-stained handkerchief hidden under the mattress. A sailor docked in Bridgeport swore he saw a Crane board a Danish cargo ship the night Thomas died, though the ship's manifest listed no such name. Just as suspicion mounted against Eleanor, investigators made a new discovery. Behind a cabinet in the Delaney home's basement, police found a false wall barely large enough to crawl into. Inside, a rusted box containing letters, a small revolver, and a bottle of laudanum. The letters, unmistakably written in Eleanor's hand, were a mix of passionate declarations and panic instructions. One in particular, dated March 3rd, 1874, read, "If he suspects, it's over. I cannot lose everything. He says we must act. I am frightened, but I love you. I will do what I must." But most confounding was the revolver, not the murder weapon. The caliber didn't match, and it had never been fired. Why hide a second gun? Eleanor was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Her trial in July 1874 drew massive crowds. Newspapers from New York, Boston, even Philadelphia sent reporters. Some dubbed her the Black Widow of Bridgeport, while others saw her as a naive woman led astray by a manipulative man. The prosecution's case hinged on the love letters and the claim that Eleanor wanted to inherit Thomas's estate, valued at nearly $30,000, a fortune for time. They portrayed her as cold, calculating, and secretive. But Eleanor's defense team, led by young attorney Charles Pendleton, stunned the court by presenting an alternative theory. Thomas Delaney had discovered the affair and staged his own death to destroy Eleanor. The theory sounded absurd, until Pendleton presented a signed affidavit from Thomas's former business partner, who claimed Thomas once said, "If that girl ever shames me, I'll ruin her. Better to die a martyr than live a fool." Just as the jury prepared to deliberate, Pendleton dropped a final bombshell. The anonymous letter that launched the investigation had not been anonymous at all. Using a forensic technique pioneered in France, the ink and typewriting style were traced back to a machine purchased by Thomas Delaney himself, just 3 months prior to his death. Was it possible Thomas had forged a letter to spark suspicion against Eleanor? Had he discovered the affair and manipulated events to ensure her downfall? In the end, the jury was divided. While Eleanor was not found guilty of murder, she was convicted of manslaughter, with a belief that she had contributed to Thomas's death through deceit and moral neglect. She served 17 years in Wethersfield Prison, released in 1891. She lived her final days under the name Eleanor Hartley in a small boarding house in Hartford, giving piano lessons and never speaking of the trial again. To this day, the murder of Thomas Delaney remains unsolved. Historians argue whether Eleanor was a murderess, a scapegoat, or simply a pawn in a cruel man's game. The second revolver was never linked to any crime, and Samuel Crane's body was never found. The Delaney house was torn down in 1902. Local legend claims that on rainy spring nights, passers-by could still hear a woman sobbing through the walls. What really happened on Golden Hill Street? Was justice served, or was the truth buried with a man who may have written his own downfall?